So, in the second prefecture of Orphetus, when large funds had been laid out on the trappings of the show, Constantius passed through Ocriculum in a tremendous state, escorted by a formidable body of troops. It was almost as if a campaign were in prospect, and the sight attracted the unwavering gaze of all beholders. As he approached the city, he let his eye dwell without expression on the senators paying their humble duty, and the venerable images of the patrician families. It did not occur to him, as it had to Cineas, the celebrated envoy of Pyrrhus, that he was beholding an assembly of kings. His thought was rather that here was a place of sanctuary for the whole world. And when he turned towards the populace, he was amazed to see in what numbers people of every race had flocked to Rome. His own appearance might have been designed as a show of strength to overawe the Euphrates or the Rhine. A double line of standards went before him, and he himself was seated on a golden car gleaming with various precious stones, whose mingled radiance seemed to throw a sort of shimmering light. Behind the motley cavalcade that preceded him, the emperor's person was surrounded by purple banners woven in the form of dragons, and attached to the tops of gilded and jeweled spears. The breeze blew through their gaping jaws, so that they seemed to be hissing with rage, and their voluminous tails streamed behind them on the wind. On each side marched a file of men-at-arms, with shields and plumed helmets, whose shining breastplates cast a dazzling light. At intervals were mailed cavalrymen, the so-called ironclads, wearing masks and equipped with cuirasses and belts of steel. They seemed more like statues polished by the hand of Praxiteles than living men. Their limbs were entirely covered by a garment of thin circular plates, fitted to the curves of the body, and so cunningly articulated that it adapted itself to any movement the wearer needed to make. The emperor was greeted with welcoming cheers, which were echoed from the hills and riverbanks, but in spite of the din he exhibited no emotion, but kept the same impassive air as he commonly wore before his subjects in the provinces. Though he was very short, he stooped when he passed under a high gate. Otherwise he was like a dummy, gazing straight before him as if his head were in a vice, and turning neither to right nor left. When a wheel jolted, he did not nod, and at no point was he seen to spit or to wipe or rub his face or nose or to move his hand. All this was no doubt affectation. But he gave other evidence too in his personal life of an unusual degree of self-control, which one was given to believe belonged to him alone. As for his habit throughout his reign of never allowing any private person to share his carriage or be his colleague in the consulship, as many deified emperors have, and many other similar customs, which his towering pride led him to observe as if they had all the sanctity of law, I will pass them by, because I am conscious that I have reported them as they occurred. As soon as he entered Rome, the home of empire and of all perfection, he went to the rostra, and looked with amazement at the forum, that sublime monument of pristine power. Wherever he turned, he was dazzled by the concentration of wonderful sights. And then on we go. This is Ammianus Marcellinus' Ab Urbe Condita, his history of the city of Rome. And we're looking at book 10. I've just said all sorts of falsehoods. We're looking at book 16, chapter 10. So, sorry about that. Ammianus Marcellinus, and you are here, though, of course, you're not here for Roman history. This, as I say, is Christian Spirituality, Chapters in the History of Your Faith. And I am your host, Matthew Hoskin, Professor of Christian History at Davenant Hall, who's losing his voice, but couldn't help but make this video for the first week in Advent. In this podcast, I go through different chapters, different moments or texts or persons or events in the history of the spirituality of the Christian faith and religion, and generally chronological order. This, however, is our third week in a row doing the 4th century completely out of order, since we did Irenaeus and the Gnostics, and should really be moving on to my series of episodes about Tertullian, who I have more than a few things to say about. But it's Advent. And it's podcaster's prerogative that I can just do whatever I want. Therefore, I am here, and I'm going to talk to you about Advent. My tea is a little hot. Sorry for those listening for the weird pause. But then you may be wondering, well, why on earth would I begin an episode about Advent with a description of an emperor's arrival? Well, many of you no doubt already know. Maybe you've heard someone talk about it before, and maybe you've heard this very Sunday you had a minister who said, do you know what Advent means? As my minister said to the children, it means arrival. And whose arrival are we getting ready for? And my 4-year-old says, Jesus. I apologize. So yes, Advent comes from the Latin word Adventus, which means arrival. And I often think about it in relation to the Adventus. I'm going to pronounce the V, the Adventus of the emperor in late antiquity has sort of become a thing that has lodged itself in my mind. And so I wanted to share with you, as the cold open, this passage from Ammianus. Ammianus is a historian of the later Roman Empire, writing probably around 381. We only have the latter portion of his work, which I don't think is actually called Ab Urbe Condita. I'm terribly sorry that I've completely... The Penguin Classic simply calls it the later Roman Empire, which is not what he would have called it in real life. So this is a bit of a historian fail. Anyway, Ammianus, as I say, 4th century Latin writer. And and he gives us, he's a secular historian though, right? So we're not actually, when we read these things, we're not actually reading things. There we go. It's the Res Gestae. And so when you read the Res Gestae of Ammianus, you're not, of course, reading it for religion. And Ammianus himself is not a Christian. And so his observations, perhaps, on the Christian religion are actually interesting because they're an outsider's observations from these decades when the Roman Empire is in the midst of Christianization. So it's actually, I think is interesting. You don't even need to care about Christianity to find him interesting, though, and that's not for me the primary interest, because I like late Roman history, even if I can't remember the names of the historians' works. I blame the fact that I'm a bit ill right now on my inability to remember the two words Res Gestae. So that's sort of who Ammianus is. He's sort of a big fan of the Emperor Julian, although he thinks that it was not fair of Julian to ban Christians from teaching rhetoric. So he's an interesting figure. He's an Easterner who writes in Latin, who has spent time in Rome, who has sort of held some magistracies in the late Roman bureaucracy. But he's writing in, nevertheless, although when we say, Ammianus is an Easterner, it is interesting that he is writing in a tradition of historical writing that goes back to people like Tacitus, of whom, and you sort of tack on the next installment onto the histories of men like Tacitus. So I chose, therefore, this passage from Ammianus, to get back to the topic of Advent, of an imperial Adventus, to make us think about what it is that people are thinking about when they're thinking about Advent. We recently had the Sunday of Christ the King, and on Christmas is the actual Adventus, right? It is the actual arrival that we commemorate. At the Nativity, we commemorate the arrival of the Christ. And he arrives in a different manner from the emperor, of course. We read that the emperor, he arrives, he's in Italy, he's in what you might think of as like the home provinces. And he's setting out from Orcriculum to the city. You might have noticed that Ammianus just calls Rome as he approached the city. This means Rome. So he's approaching Rome. And he just stretches out all the panoply. All of the beautiful things are arrayed out. And all the fancy finery. And it's as though he is going to war. But he's really just showing up. He's showing up at Rome. Rome is still, it is the mother city of the empire. It is still the place where the Senate meets. There is still an imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. And so it's an important place to be. And so he's going to pull out all the stops. He's going to do a big show and show off just how his own glory and his own splendor. And everyone responds, right? People come out and they line the entrance into the city. And you have the senators come out to greet him, and the patricians, the upper class families, and they're holding like the portraits of their families as well as he comes. And he enters, and he's like a statue, right? Ammianus describes him as being, this translation says dummy. I think of it as a statue. And he's looking neither to the right nor to the left. He's not moving at all. He's got this. He looks like he and his soldiers look like they've been carved by Praxiteles, one of the great carvers of the ancient world. And this is, I talked about this when I was talking about Constantine before, who's the father of the Emperor Constantius. This is the sacralization of the imperial person, that the Roman emperors have. They are special. They are set apart. Which indeed is what sacer or sacred means. And so he's coming in, and he is not like a man. He is like a statue, but really what do you make statues of if you're a pagan like Ammianus? You make statues of the gods, right? And so he is like a god. And indeed, if you think of the Stoic concept of apatheia or dispassion, when it is being criticized, this concept is used by some Christians. It is criticized by St. Jerome. St. Jerome actually says a man who has achieved apatheia must be either a rock or a god, right? And so then that's the sort of, the emperor has made himself a visual example of what divinity is like, as though what God could be like, right? And so this is the Adventus. It is the great glorious thing. And people, there are all sorts of things that you do. And this is a standard Adventus. He has to duck little on his way through, which is interesting because he's short. And so this as well is like reminding us of the bigness of the emperor, right? In late Roman and medieval art, the emperor is always bigger than other people in the scene. You might have noticed that. Or the king or the emperor or whoever, or Jesus tends to be physically larger than the other people represented. This isn't because they were morons who thought that these guys were literally that big. It's because it is to highlight the symbolic greatness of the emperor, the king, God himself incarnate in flesh. And so then Constantius has made himself into a living representation of himself. Basically, he's turned himself into a statue for the Adventus. And he comes in and he's covered in jewels and he's glistening and glimmering. And it's remarkable and beautiful. And it is supposed to invoke awe. And that's what's going on in an Adventus. It is the arrival of the emperor. And he's going to pay special attention to the city, right? He goes to the forum, he goes to the rostrum. This is this platform where people deliver speeches, where the beaks of Carthaginian ships have been arrayed. They are called rostra. And he goes and he makes a speech in the Senate, in the Curia, to the assembled senators who are still there, still living in Rome, still doing their thing. And so this is what he's doing, and he puts on games and he does all those sorts of things when he comes to town, and he shows his favor. And when an emperor comes to Rome or any other city, he also has business that he does. He attends to the needs of the people. Right, so we have descriptions of, say, Theodosius I and his Adventus, and the sorts of things that he cares about when he arrives, and he looks into the concerns. An emperor looks into the concerns of the people of the city where he is visiting. And so this is what is going on in the Adventus. And there is an interesting thing. since we're talking about the history of spirituality, that we have to think about, because today, and there's a temptation to go immediately to this, from talking about the imperial Adventus, to jump straight to, but when Jesus came, it was not in great glory, but in lowliness and in humility, as a baby. And there are patristic precedents for talking that way. But for a lot of people in late antiquity, it is also, they are thinking, because in Advent, you're also preparing for the second coming of Christ, or the third coming if you're a Cistercian. And so then the second coming, if you're a Cistercian, is into your own heart. Don't worry. You are preparing for him, and he will be coming in great glory to judge the nations. He will be coming like Constantius. He may be coming riding on a white horse, in fact. And so this is what's going on here. But in fact, the fathers do compare these two things. And so I have here for you what for many people will be the reading in the month of December, which is On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius. This is the translation by Father John Behr. This is the one that comes with the introduction by C.S. Lewis. And he says that, and now the very corruption of death no longer holds ground against human beings because of the indwelling word in them through the one body. As when a great king has entered some large city and made his dwelling in one of the houses in it. Such a city is certainly made worthy of high honor, and no longer does any enemy or bandit descend upon it, but it is rather reckoned worthy of all care because of the king's having taken residence in one of its houses. So also does it happen with the king of all. Coming himself into our realm, and dwelling in a body like the others, every design of the enemy against human beings has henceforth ceased, and the corruption of death, which had prevailed formerly against them, perished. For the race of human beings would have been utterly dissolved had not the Master and Saviour of all, the Son of God, come for the completion of death. Truly, this great work supremely befitted the goodness of God. For if a king constructed a house or a city, and it is attacked by bandits because of the carelessness of its inhabitants, he in no way abandons it, but avenges and saves it as his own work, having regard not for the carelessness of the inhabitants, but for his own honor. All the more so, the God-word of the all-good Father did not neglect the race of human beings created by himself, which was going to corruption, but he blotted out the death which had occurred through the offering of his own body, and correcting their carelessness by his own teaching, restoring every aspect of human beings by his own power. So here we see talking about just as Constantius, although, Athanasius would actually have been alive at the time of Constantius' Adventus to the city of Rome. He outlives Constantius by 12 years. He is also not on good terms with the Emperor Constantius II, as it turns out. He gets exiled by him multiple times. Anyway, so Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria in the 300s, from the sort of like the late 320s through to the year 373 when he dies, had been present as a deacon at the Council of Nicaea. He writes this work on the Incarnation in the early years of the what we call Arian or Nicene crisis. And what's fascinating is that there's no mention actually of the Emperor Constantine, for example, in this at all. And it's like the great triumph of Christianity that someone like Eusebius is a big fan of, and he's sort of lauding Constantine quite highly. It's like that hasn't even happened in his worldview, because for Athanasius and his theology, what matters most of all isn't who's the emperor. It isn't what is the temporal reality of Christ's church militant here on earth. It is, what is the great glorious goodness of God doing? Who is Christ, and what does that mean for us? What must we do to grasp salvation? Or, as he points out, what has God done to save us and grasp us and pull us up? And so this is what he's talking about here. And nevertheless, he lives in this world with emperors and kings, and he seems to assume, in fact, that some form of monarchy is the ideal form of government. Now, I live in Canada, constitutional monarchy. And I like King Charles III, so I'm not going to argue with him. Anyway, and so here he is in this world. And so you think of the thing that I read from Ammianus at the beginning. This is part of his world map, his vision of how the world works, that a king arrives and he has all these things. But also there's a great honor comes to the city when the king is there. Right? There's great honor that comes to Rome when the emperor is there. In Greek, they don't have this aversion to the word king basileus that in Latin the Romans do to the word rex. And so then they tend to call the people who in Latin would be Augusti or Imperatores or whatever, they tend to call them basileus. They don't have a problem referring to the emperor as king. So the king has come. The king has had his Adventus, and great favor and great honor comes upon that city. And the bandits are not morons. Death, therefore, who in this part of on the Incarnation is the enemy who's being overcome and slain. That Christ is going to trample down death by death. Death is not going to come near the human habitation so long as the king, Jesus, is there. So he comes in, and so his incarnation is this theologically explosive event that transforms everything. Because God has entered into creation and he has taken humanity up into himself. And this is what the Adventus, the arrival of the true King, Lord, and Emperor of the universe means. But he hasn't done it just because he wants to show off how awesome he is. Or, like perhaps Constantius or any Roman emperor would do. He's doing it for this other reason, that just like emperors who go on campaigns, go to towns to liberate them or protect them from the enemy, so also this is what God is doing, right? It's not just that the bandits don't want to attack the city while the king is there. It's that this king has chosen of his own free will to enter into this city for the purpose of liberating it, setting it free from the bandits. And this is the beautiful, glorious truth that Athanasius is preaching here. And why has he done this? Athanasius says, why does the king do his Adventus? Well, Constantius didn't build Rome. In a sense, Rome built Constantius, but God made the world. He made the habitation of the human heart. He made every human person. And he would be a neglectful king of the world if he did not come to rescue his creation. And so this is why God has come, is out of love for his people. He comes to save it as his own work. So he did not neglect the race of human beings, but he blotted out the death which had occurred. And how does he do it? Through the offering of his own body. So once again, he has these royal images that he uses that will remind the keen reader of what Ammianus talks about. But it is all turned, and it is this remarkable, glorious truth that God isn't just like the emperor, glorious and dazzling in fine array, like Constantius. God isn't a God, although impassible in the technical terminology of theology, which is something Athanasius would say, isn't unmoved. Well, he is unmoved, but he moves, and he comes, and he has perfect self-mastery, just like Constantius. And he comes moving himself out of his own love, self-activating love, self-generating love, in order to come and to rescue his creation, which he loves, to set free his people who are dying and being destroyed and going down to the darkness of death. And that is the meaning of Advent. It is the Adventus of the King, the arrival of the Emperor of the universe. Athanasius says for his own honor, yes, but not just for that, not for the pomp, not for the show, not to increase his power, but out of love for that which he has made, love for you, my friend. So I'm going to close now with the Collect for Advent 1 from the Book of Common Prayer, one of the prayers written by Thomas Cranmer himself back in 1549. Almighty God, give us grace that we may cast away the works of darkness and put upon us the armor of light, now in the time of this mortal life, in which thy Son, Jesus Christ, came to visit us in great humility, that in the last day, when he shall come again in his glorious majesty to judge both the quick and the dead, we may rise to the life immortal. Through him who liveth and reigneth with thee in the Holy Spirit, now and ever. Amen.